Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in and with me for a while today. And that will take you to Sweden. I'm in Sweden today. Let me introduce myself. My name is Imelda Almqvist, and I'm in my forest house in Sweden. Just had a herd of deer outside the window, but they have run off now. So no point in tilting the laptop. So I'm a teacher of sacred art and also of Seidr and Old Norse traditions. And people often call that Norse shamanism, but that's a really unfortunate choice of words. But that's probably what, what most people call it. I'm also a painter, and of course, I am an author. And so far, I've published 4 books with Moon Books. And the first one is Born Shamans. I'll just show them all quickly. About spiritual toolkit work with children. The second one is Sacred Art. What makes sacred art different from other art expressions. The third one, all related, was Medicine of the Imagination. Dwelling in possibility. There are always more possibilities than like we think if we stay within the confines of our own thinking. So sometimes we need to break out of that. And last but not least, this is the book I'm going to talk about today in my presentation. This is North Sea Water in My Veins, and was published only a week ago, so it's fresh off the press. And it's had a very pleasing amount of interest, so I'm really pleased with the responses I've had so far, actually. I've also made a PowerPoint because I'm afraid there are going to be quite a lot of Dutch words in my presentation today, and I know from teaching Old Norse material that people just get lost if I don't provide the spelling, so people get a handle on how words are spelled. So let me try and bring that up for a moment. So I'm going to share my screen. And here we go. So I hope you can all see that now. I can certainly see it myself. So the topic for my talk today is about the search for an ancestral and native spirituality. And I got a really lovely response and quote from Robert Moss, who is the really well-known, famous actually, dream teacher. And he said that your book on the spiritual traditions of the Low Countries is a wonderful contribution to soul recovery, finely streaming together your polylinguistic research and your depth of experiential work. So that's a really nice summary of this book. So thank you, Robert Moss, for that. So why is this work of recovering or retrieving or excavating our native ancestral spirituality so important? Well, I'll give you the reasons for that. These are the really hard-earned wisdom teachings of our ancestors, and they reflect many centuries of experience. So if we let that drop into oblivion, there may not be many ways of getting that back. So it's really important to sort of also to make an archive of what we have, make directories, and so get all the information down. Also talk to people who are still alive, who can tell us things about the way that ancestors did things. Then there is also a really big issue in the world today, and if you are a spiritual person, you're probably aware of that, and that's the issue of countercultural appropriation. And many indigenous elders and councils are really urging us to do that, because for a couple of decades, maybe longer, there was a mood where people would go on, you could almost call it spiritual tourism, or you could be you could be more forgiving and say that people felt that our own spirituality was lost, so we needed to go somewhere else and maybe borrow a spirituality. But what then happened is that a lot of people are running with, say, Native American material or material from South America or whatever it may be. And often the kind of permission settings around that are very, very dubious. The fact that another culture practices something doesn't give us the right to take it for ourselves. And then, of course, there has also been colonization and a lot of abuse. So there is a lot of painful history there. And we really need to educate ourselves about that. And then another point I would make is that a spiritual belief system borrowed from another part of the world, and often another continent, is not going to reflect the landscapes, traditions, and spirits of place of our country of birth and origin. Or I know that like people move around or grow up in countries, that do not reflect their what do you call it? Their origin, maybe. But then it's still like the country where, we spend our childhood, or where we spend the most time during our like upbringing, meaning that we absorb like the education and the general cultural markers. So such a country, even if it's not like your country of birth originally, is still going to have a huge impact on you. And that's like sort of well worth looking into, like, what is the ancestral material there? Like, what are the shaping forces in that culture? So that's why I feel this work is so important. And then, of course, if one accepts that this is important work, and people are going to have mixed opinions on that, the question is, how is it done? So I can tell you what I did in the process of writing this book. I did a lot of research. So that means reading old texts, visiting archives, reading books by local experts, also like bringing up academic papers. Academia EDU is a fantastic site. It's amazing what you can find there and what's being uploaded there every day. But also, it may involve learning a new language to access material which is not available in translation. And it may also involve translating material into a world language so others can gain access to the material and work with it. And this is the reason that I wrote my book in English. And quite a few people in the Netherlands were surprised. They thought this book was going to be in Dutch. And I've had to explain to them that, no, I want all people of Dutch extraction, even like, say, third or fourth generation people, in, say, Canada or the US or New Zealand or wherever people may be. I want these people, even if they do not speak Dutch, so they can't read in the original language, to gain access to the material so they can understand what their ancestors did and why they did it. And I feel very strongly about that. So another important part of this work is interviewing older, generally family members, and recording their memories, family stories, their spiritual experiences, how illnesses were handled, the stories their parents and grandparents told them in childhood, all of those kinds of things. So it's a really good idea to formulate specific questions and really like push a little bit, and then start your own archive of notes, videos, recordings, or, like whatever modern technology you want to use. And I'm not a tech goddess. I use old technology some of the time. Then another step is trying out techniques used by our ancestors for ourselves with an open mind and just seeing where that takes us. It also involves talking to fellow practitioners, assuming there are some, about their experiences with, say, local deities, spiritual forces, and they're like cosmology, their understanding of how the cosmos hangs together. A very important thing, if possible, because of course, we've had a pandemic and people have not been able to travel. So I understand there can be issues with that. But now, like, the world is opening up again, is spending time on location and allowing the land to speak. And I will admit that I have not actually lived in the Netherlands for 32 years. I've lived in other countries and mostly spoken other languages for 32 years now. But spending time on location, so for me, that is the Netherlands, and allowing the land to speak and visiting key sites, significant places, is really important. Also, other forms of direct revelation. So building a personal relationship with the material, the land, the deities, and sort of other beings. And some of these beings, there are directories in my book, are quite specific to the Netherlands, and they really reflect Dutch culture and the Dutch landscapes. And, there are many other lines of inquiry, and I can't give them all, but you could look at, say, the names of your ancestors and what were the, if you have a Dutch name, like what is the meaning of that name? As far as you know, where did your ancestors live? And where they lived, you could look at the origin and the meaning of place names and names of rivers and all of those kinds of things. So, there are a lot of avenues for doing this work. So what did I discover? Well, the long version is like my book, and it's quite a thick book, and there's quite a lot of like folklore and material in there. Short version, I would say, is this presentation. So I'm going to try and give you the summary, like some of the highlights. yeah, so this is my book actually in the Netherlands. I just had to take that picture, take my book to the Netherlands and take the picture. And for me, this book was really a love letter to my country of birth. And what it aimed to do is to reconstruct that spiritual heritage of the Low Countries. And it covers pre-Christian, or if you prefer, heathen material from the Netherlands, Belgium, and also just across the border in Germany. And I've even included some bits and pieces in Afrikaans from South Africa. And for me, it was really all about answering the following question. Is there enough material for a reconstruction of an indigenous, a native pre or even non-Christian spirituality? And my conclusion was a resounding yes. When I started working on this book, I thought it was going to be a no. I wasn't at all sure I'd find enough material to even fill a book. I thought maybe I'd write an article, but no, actually it filled a book. And it really felt like I was a painter applying paint stripper to my own culture. So revealing and unveiling the animist and ancestral material. And it was really like peeling back all of these layers and seeing what does actually slumber under the veneer of everyday life in the Low Countries. So one thing that most people know about the Low Countries, especially the Netherlands in this case, is that quite a chunk of the Netherlands is below sea level. And I often get asked questions about that. Isn't that unsafe? How could people even sleep at night, etc., etc.? And of course, for Dutch people, it's completely normal. They don't think about it every day. And I did a bit of research. So as of the year 2017, about 17% of the total land area of the Netherlands was reclaimed from the sea. And we call this type of low-lying land reclaimed from the sea or the river and protected by dikes and other forms of engineering, a polder. So a polder is like a Dutch word for land reclaimed from water, essentially. And this land would be underwater at high tide without all of those engineering structures. And actually my own elderly mother lives in a polder. She lives in that part of the Netherlands that is reclaimed from water. So that's where my own family comes from. And no, it's not unsafe. So I just wanted to give you a quick map as well. I don't know how often people look at a map of the Netherlands. But here on this map, so the green parts, everything that's grass green, is like original land. That was always there. But everything that is another color, like yellow or brown or whatever, see a lot here, here, and quite a lot here as well. That's all reclaimed from the sea. So that's a fair amount of the land in the Netherlands. And also, I'm a teacher of rune magicians and currently writing a book about the runes. So I just wanted to say that the Netherlands are also known as the Low Countries by the Sea. And if the Netherlands have a dedicated rune, like the Frisian rune row that I work with, that would be Lagu or Lagus, the water rune, and you can see that here. I also just wanted to bring up kind of the contents. So here are the topics my book covers. I'm not going to read all of that out. You can just maybe quickly read that while I'm talking. You'd probably sort of bring it up on Amazon as well and just like have a look inside the book if you want to know more. But it's quite a variety of topics, I would say. Really try to weave in everything I could find. And other things you'll find in the book, there is a glossary of Dutch words related to the native spirituality, so words that crop up in the quotes I give and the stories I tell. And I've also included a rune summary for the Frisian rune row, and that's all illustrated with examples that come from the Netherlands. So like I've tried to make it as Dutch as I could make it, so to speak. And just for those of you who are not so familiar with the runes, you might find it interesting to just see what these runes look like. So this is the Anglo-Frisian rune row. It's very close also to the Northumberland rune row. And sort of, in reality, there are very minor variations, but I'm not going to go into all that because this is not a rune magician class. But I thought you might find it interesting to just see that. Go to the next. And I start the book with providing some Dutch history, just to sort of, give a context of like where these stories play out. And the thing that really struck me, there is a story about a Frisian king, Radboud, we say, and it becomes Radboud in English. And he famously came close to being baptized, but he refused when he was told that his heathen ancestors would not be waiting for him in heaven. And his reply was that he strongly preferred spending eternity in hell to hanging out in heaven with his enemies. So that's kind of like thought-provoking on many levels. And I will also say that Frisia is a province of the Netherlands, but for like part of history, it operated almost as a kind of, not quite a country in its own right, but it's sort of a place with a very strong local identity. And the place where I grew up is across the water, more to the west, in West Frisia. So when I was a very young child growing up in the Netherlands, I spoke the West Frisian dialect, which was then sort of trained out of me when I started primary school in another location. And today I couldn't speak Frisian or West Frisian, but you know, that was sort of the language of my childhood. So I just needed to move the PowerPoint, my apologies. So one thing you'll find in this book is a directory of ancient and like native. I think some people don't like us using the word indigenous. I'll say indeed native might be a better word, goddesses. So if you go to the Netherlands and you stop any Dutch person in the street and you say, okay, please give me the name of a typically Dutch god or goddess, I think you would hear about Wodan, which is a sort of Dutch Germanic name for Odin, really. Then you can have a discussion about if that's exactly the same god or not, and opinions are divided. But we're going to keep it a bit simplified here for the purposes of this presentation. And the other name you will hear is Donar. And Donar is like the Dutch or Germanic name for the god Thor, Norse god Thor. And someone might also mention Frau Holle or Mother Holle. You know, she's the one who shakes out her bedding and her pillows to make it snow. But really only self-educated pagan people are committed to following a heathen or pagan earth religion path, may talk to you about Nehalenia, Baduhenna, Tanfana, or Ludana. And they're like other Dutch goddesses as well, but just lifting out, four of the, maybe bigger ones with a big following. And here's just a quick picture. This is a painting I did about Frau Holle, who has a very strong connection to children. And we'll see later in this presentation that she really has the role of a psychopomp for children, meaning that, sad as it is, but, there was a lot of child mortality in earlier days, and not all children lived into adulthood. And Frau Holle is very much associated as being the sort of the goddess or the deity who comes and collects the souls of children who die and sort of, takes them home, which is also why she became quite feared. But she's equally connected to like fertility and rituals around like birth and souls coming into the world. So she's an interesting goddess. And here's another painting I did of her. She's sometimes reported to have a goose foot, and that kind of links her to Mother Goose as well. So there's lots of rich material there. Again, it falls outside the scope of this presentation, but you can read more about that in the book itself. So starting then with a very typically Dutch goddess, Nehalenia. And we know about her from about 60 inscriptions that were found in Belgium, Germany, and also in the Netherlands, where the majority is. And our impression of her, from what we know, is that she was a mother goddess, a protector of sailing vessels, because, the Dutch were a sailing nation surrounded by all that water, very much a seafaring nation until today. And she was also a deity of hearth and home. And the religious practices or spiritual practices surrounding her, they peaked in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, CE, Common Era, shouldn't have put AD there. And at that time, there were at least 2 or 3 temples located in the province of Zeeland. So that's in the western Netherlands, quite close to the border with Belgium. And that's where the Dutch, some of the Dutch islands are. And, this region at that time was an important seafaring link, because that's where, traders would sail up the Rhine and sort of, go back and forth. So there was traffic even between Britain, then you had the Netherlands and Germany. So that was an entry point into the Netherlands. But then sort of the Nehelenia kind of like dropped into oblivion, basically. And then in the year 1645, there was a huge storm which eroded dunes in a town called Domburg. So that's on the coast in that same province, Zeeland. And this storm revealed the remains of a temple dedicated to the goddess Nehelenia. And then from 1970 onwards, like more material was found, thrown up again by storms and, other things, maybe some excavation as well. And we then also found numerous altars. There were remains of female sculptures and other artifacts. And these things were found in a town called Kolijnsplaat, again in the same province. And that included the roof tiles and the remains of a temple devoted to Nehelenia. And what the Dutch people in that province decided to do, they decided to rebuild it. So actually in 2005, a replica of this temple was built, and that can be visited today. And hang on, I need to move up the PowerPoint again. Oops, where are we? Okay. So here is a picture of one of these votive stones to Nehelenia, so you can see what that looked like. And in a moment, I'll bring up a picture of the temple, the new temple, the replica as well. So that's what that looks like today. And that's quite lovely to think that it sort of sits there and people can visit the temple again and pay their respects to Nehelenia. I think that's a beautiful piece of work. I also find it quite extraordinary. I did most of my education in the Netherlands. I lived there until I was 23. And years of history classes in the Netherlands, and never any mention about these ancient goddesses and all the sort of, other pieces of history that I have unearthed. Find that quite extraordinary that we have a temple washing up from the sea. And here in history classes, I learned about all sorts of battles and things, but I didn't learn about this. I only discovered this when I started doing research for my book. Quite extraordinary. Then moving on to the next goddess. There is a goddess called Baduhenna, and she is a Frisian goddess. So she was really big in that province, Frisia. Already talked about that. And then we have the Roman author Tacitus, and he wrote about the Battle of Baduhenna. So that's how we know about that. And he then describes an attack by the Frisians on the Romans, because this was during the time of the Roman Empire and occupation. So the Romans had invaded the Netherlands. And for a long time, that was kind of okay. The Frisians were really independent. They didn't mind the Roman presence too much. There was trade going on. But then at some point, a guy called Olenius took control of the area, and he demanded really severe taxes from the Frisians to be paid in aurochs and skins. And that was something that the Frisians didn't have access to. There were no aurochs in the Netherlands, in that part of the Netherlands, at that time. So the Frisians, initially sold all they could to make those tax payments. That's really terrible. Apparently, there's stories of some people selling off their own wives and daughters into slavery. That's really horrible. But eventually they got so angry and they rebelled, and, they took the battle. And actually the Frisians won the battle. And according to the description by Tacitus, that was because Baduhenna, like a great war goddess, was flying over the battlefield, and she favored the Frisians like her own people. So that worked to the favor of the Frisians. So that's Baduhenna. And when I work with her, she sits very much on that boundary between life and death. She has a connection to birds of prey, especially crows and ravens. You could make some connection to, say, the Valkyries of the Northern tradition. So to me, she often appears like a kind of raven mother or, raven goddess. So that's Baduhenna. And then another group of beings I want to mention, and again, this took my breath away again, wasn't mentioned in history classes in the Netherlands, but those are the matronae or the matres, a large collective of mother goddesses. So they were really, and they're many, many names. It's incredible how many names there are. You'll find the directory in the book. And to us, they're quite mysterious because not a lot of material has been preserved. but they were indigenous goddesses of Germanic and maybe Celtic origin, and they often appeared in groups of 3. So they were often like 3 women together, a bit like the Norns of, the Northern tradition. And they were venerated during the time of the Roman Empire and, the Roman occupation of the southern parts of the Netherlands. And we have a lot of stories. The information we have is about soldiers stationed, in the Low Countries, like, having statues erected and sort of making offerings to these matronae and asking for protection and favors. So there was and that provided really good trade for the tradespeople in the Netherlands, the artists and the artisans and the people who made those votive offerings and who carved the stones and all of it. So there's lots going on there. It's very, very busy. And the other thing I could say about the matronae is that they were very much beings of place. They were like deities of place. So they were named for a river or a particular kind of tree or a cause, like, like say finding peace. Or there's even a sort of ancient grandmother, sort of goddess among the matronae. So it's actually a very interesting list for people today, if you are of Dutch Germanic extraction, to go through and see. You would find some real allies there for the causes that people are like fighting for today. So really interesting material. And I also find it incredible that there was a really large number of them, like hundreds and hundreds, and that's only what we know. And like nearly always appearing as groups of 3. So for me, that raises the question, was there ever a kind of matriarchy in old Europe? Maybe long before Christianization and patriarchy. And I know like that cannot be proven. And, again, people could have arguments about that. But I find it very, very interesting. And my biggest question is if there might have been a kind of all-female trinity before the all-male Christian Holy Trinities of, conquered Europe, and Europe became Christianized. Like, even where did that idea come from of that there would be a trinity of beings? Like the Norns are also a trinity of beings. So these are some questions that I've not answered in the book, but that I am left with after all the research I did. I'm just going to give you some examples. And we have tropical temperatures here in Sweden today, so it's quite hot. Need to drink some water. So, for instance, we have the Matres Frisavi, the mothers of the Frisian ancestors. And then you see the location where that was found. And obviously, they were associated with the Frisians, the people we call the Frisians today, the Frisi. And again, if you, like me, I am from the Netherlands, I grew up there, but also many people who may be 2nd or 3rd generation. So if you know that you have ancestors in Frisia, Frisian ancestors, these Matres or Matronae would be a very interesting group to work with, like help you maybe uncover the history of your family. So, things like that. And then just one example out of many would be the Alma Fia Heniai, and these are the elm path mothers. And I'm married to a Swedish man. So my surname is Almqvist, and that means branch of an elm tree. That's Swedish for branch of an elm tree. So of course I'm going to be interested in the elm path mothers. They're like interesting deities for me to work with. And then you can look for some other correspondences like the elm could be a feminine tree. Women ancestors, lineage. So there's lots of clues there that we can pick up and run with and do our own research. Oh yeah, I already mentioned her. There was even Kamaleda, the old great-grandmother goddess. And the location for that was Maastricht in the Netherlands, which is a city in the very, very southern sort of point of the Netherlands, very close to Belgium and Luxembourg. So it's in the very south. And her name is related to the Old Norse and also contemporary Swedish word kammal. Kammal is old in Swedish today. And also the word Edda, like as in the poetic Edda, the main text of the Old Norse traditions. And that sort of means something like great-grandmother. So, that's how we can work out what her name means. And, it's just my personal opinion that we need to do much better in venerating elders. And sort of, we really need to change the way that we look at old people and make old people feel beyond their sell-by date in many ways. So the whole notion of venerating an old great-grandmother goddess again, I think would be a great thing in doing that work, of bringing back the concept of eldering in our culture, which is another sort of pet interest of mine. Then there is a chapter in the book entirely about the wild hunt. And you may or may not have heard of it, but it refers to an ancient phenomenon. There's quite a lot written about it, where a deity, such as Odin, or in the Netherlands, Wodan, and often also another legendary figure that depends on location where the stories are coming from. And so this legendary figure leads a coastly army across the winter sky, all in Northern Europe. And it scoops up the souls of dead people who've not yet made their full transition to the other world or the land of the dead. So that's the idea that death can be compromised, and that not like even in Christian times, everyone who dies immediately scoots up to heaven, but that some people sort of need assistance, in that process of making a full transition. So like the wild hunt ties into that. And then, a related idea is that if that kind of work, we call that psychopomp work, if that is not done on a regular basis, then there is an imbalance between the worlds, and the kind of, the dead who are not at peace and not in the right place, that starts sort of exerting pressure on the living. And also it gets in the way of, people in this world, like making the space for new things and a new year and things like that. So we have many reports of the wild hunt riding out between September 6th, that is the birthday of St. Nicholas, and January 6th, which is Epiphany. And the general idea is that the veil between the worlds is really thin at that time of year. And then, you have festivals like Samhain, like Halloween, which is a bit earlier, of course, late October, and stories that, the dead can visit the living for a short while, and often in disguise, which is why children wear masks at Halloween to represent that idea. And it's really important to point out that a wild hunt also sweeps the ethers clean of old energy, meaning energetic manifestations or old thought forms which serve no more, to make space for a new year, for new beginnings and a new paradigm. And from my point of view, I think our world really needs a new paradigm, or more than one right now. So from my point of view, we need to really do the wild hunt and psychopomp work again. And do that within any tradition in your own unique way. But, that work needs to be done. Or otherwise we remain stuck in old thought forms. Okay. So I just wanted to give a quick example of who might be those leaders of the wild hunt. And in Dutch we say de wilde jacht. So in Scandinavia, Odin. Netherlands and Germany, already said, Wodan. Also Vrouw Holle, Mother Holle, and a related figure, Berchta Perchta. In England, King Arthur, Herne the Hunter, King Hurla. In Wales, it would be Quinn ap Nut, the ruler of the underworld. And there is also the trickster hero Gwydion. And in Ireland, we have mentions of the fairy cavalcade, and, led by various mythological heroes and so forth. So the leader of the wild hunt depended on the location you were in. But all of these sort of, that whole larger area, we have stories about the wild hunt, in the sources from all of them in different languages. So that was quite a big thing. And this I have just said. And, it's a terrible tragedy what's happening in the Ukraine right now. And, look at the way people are dying and the numbers of people dying. So it's very clear to me that, the world needs soul conductors, people doing psychopomp work. It's compassionate work, a form of healing work, really, and healing the balance between the worlds. Then another group of beings in the Netherlands are the so-called de witte wieven. And that means to wise, witty, pale or translucent ladies. Doesn't refer to skin color at all, but it's that coastly sort of see-through quality, that you sort of see them, but you also see through them. And in Dutch myths and legends, these witte wieven or witte wijven, alternative spelling, are often perceived as the spirits of wise women from ancient Neolithic times. And they may even be related to elven beings. And some authors even connect them to the Norns, called the schikgodinnen in the Netherlands. And these stories all come from the eastern parts of the Netherlands, not from the western part of the Netherlands I am from. So in the book, you'll find a lot of stories about them. You'll get a feel for them. And when I made a cover painting for my book, of course, I had to put the Witte Wieven in there, and also I'll talk about it in a moment, the Hunebedden, these were famous passage graves and standing stones we have in the Netherlands. In Christian times, these Witte Wieven were demonized, and also they became feared. They were said to play tricks on local people. But the general understanding from an earlier time is that they actually supported community life, that they would often help out with farm work or housekeeping jobs at night. We have these stories of jobs mysteriously finished in the night. But this required a good relationship where, they were respected and honored, like fair energy exchange, that if we treat them well and we respect them and honor them, they will also treat us well. But obviously, once the Netherlands became Christianized and these Witte Wieven became demonized, that all sort of tilted, and it became a much more difficult thing because people weren't allowed to venerate them anymore, and eventually people became afraid of them. And again, same as with the Matronae or the Noorns, the Witte Wieven often appear in groups of 3. So we have another sacred group of three women, 3 beings. So it's a sacred number, and that's interesting. And the Hunebedden is the Dutch word for these passage graves, often 2 big stones with a slab on top, and often an entire row of them. And the Witte Wieven were often spotted at Hunebedden or even sitting on top of them. And we generally call them passage graves in English. I'll show you some pictures. Hang on, I need to move the PowerPoint again. Bear with me, please. And here we go. So this is such a hunebed in Drenthe, a really, really large one. And that's what they look like. So, you could imagine those Witte Wieven sort of sitting on top, like maybe using a spinning wheel, and there might be a full moon in the sky, and it would all be very sort of magical and, a little bit intimidating. And here's another one. This is a smaller hunebed in the Dutch province of Drenthe, which is in the east, like near the German border of the Netherlands. Then there is a chapter in the book about witchcraft, and of course also about the witch trials, because what happened in the rest of Europe and even in many other locations happened in the Netherlands as well. So one Dutch word for witches is nachtvrouwen, like women of the night, because, witches were said to kind of move around, fly around, and sort of, visit other locations at night. So that key period of witch hunts and witch trials that we all know about from history occurred in Europe between the 1500s and 1700s, and it all happened in the Low Countries as well. And it was really severe. I was shocked to read that, children were involved, and even really young children were executed, like 7-year-old girls who were executed along with their mother. I mean, really horrible stuff. It's really hard, in any language, but also in Dutch, to read these witch trial transcripts. And the general sort of religious idea, misconception behind that was that powerful magic could only be worked with the assistance of the devil or demonic beings. And then that power could be used to obtain whatever riches, sex, knowledge, and worldly goods and power. I mean, that seemed to have been the core idea. So anyway, entire chapter about witchcraft, like in the Dutch setting or Low Country setting, larger area setting. Some of these stories are plain interesting as well. Like we find accounts, and I had no idea, of witches traveling and flying around in eggshells. Now I know that witches fly on broomsticks, but eggshells was a new idea for me. And that people had customs around this, after cooking, they would crumble up the eggshells or smash it all up. So there wasn't an actual sort of eggshell for a witch to fly in. And apparently they would fly in eggshells even across the North Sea and visit England as well. Lots of witch traffic going on there. This was news to me. And I'll just show you a picture of Sinterklaas as well, as we call him. That is Saint Nicholas, very much closely tied, to the 6th of December. And, I was talking about the wild hunt earlier. And today in the Netherlands, he's like the saint who delivers presents for children and drops treats in their shoes. But one of the discoveries that really shook me doing this research was learning that if you go all the way back to the centuries, St. Nicholas was apparently the psychopomp or the soul conductor arriving in early December, as I described earlier, to collect the souls of the unquiet dead and to make sure they make a full transition to the afterlife. And even St. Nicholas has sometimes been linked to and named as a leader of the wild hunt, the wilde jacht. I had no idea. So that also put like a whole different, again, if you're inclined to do psychopomp work and you're Dutch, puts a whole different filter on what's going on there. So there's a chapter about that in the book. And if you speak Dutch, I know that most of you won't, I recommend the book by Louis Janssen, Nicolaas de Duivel and de Goden. And he makes the vital point that the solidarity between the living and the dead was a crucial aspect of early medieval Christianity. So here we had like Frau Holle sort of flying around, across the Milky Way with children. That's another painting I did for an art video. There are like many others. There's a chapter about corpse roads and coffin roads, and again, there were a lot of beliefs really about, the relationship between the living and the dead and like how we need to be in right relationship with the dead. And also that informs like funeral rites and how we bury people, all to ensure that, people make that transition to the land of the dead and that we don't end up with, that imbalance between the worlds, or even worse, situations where houses become haunted, or, in the very worst case, people become possessed. So there's a whole sort of body of material there. And again, you'll have to read the book to see all of that, because, I have limited time for this presentation. So there are certain sort of corpse routes in the landscape that were followed by people taking a coffin to a funeral. And then there's a lot of folklore saying like the wild hunt would have followed those same lines in the landscape. So lots of interesting material. Then you have the concept of dwaallichtjes. It's like little sort of, like you see it here as well, corpse lights, like little sort of lights moving across the landscape. That's all tied in to, the psychopomp material and the wild hunt as well. And, again, it's about like being in right relationship with the dead, something we don't do very well in our culture. I'm going to be running out of time, so I'm going to like flip forward a bit. As I said, it's all in the book, so you can find it there. Okay. So I think maybe the last thing I want to give a quick mention, and I'm going to do, questions and comments, is like, did you know that there was actually a whole, landmass called Doggerland that existed? You can see here on the map, you have like the Ice Age, everything is under ice. And then sort of a bit later in time, there was like a landmass just sort of north of the, the coast of the Netherlands, sort of about here, where like people lived. And, eventually that place sort of, it sank down, or maybe, the water levels were rising as the ice was melting. And so it went down. It now lies on the bottom of the sea. But it's kind of a bit like an Atlantis of the North. So became quite fascinated by that as well. So I think I'm reaching my time limit here. So I hope you found this interesting, and I'm going to open up the floor for questions and comments now. Okay, so let's see. How would I know that Frau Holle is not the Kaliak? They are both connected to snow. Thank you so much for this presentation. Oh, that's great to have a Dutch person here. I think that becomes a question like, is Wodan the same god as Odin? Because we often find a local sort of expressions of these beings. To me, Frau Holle is quite different as well. I'm not an expert on the Kaliak, but I have like looked into her and worked with her a bit. And I can absolutely see that there are correspondences and connections, but I still think there is quite a different flavor to them. So from my point of view, yes, they are connected, and, they're both like fabulous teachers and beings to work with. But to my mind, they're not exactly the same being. But that's like a personal take. Of course, you can arrive at your own take on that. And I encourage you to do so and let me know what you find. see if we have other questions. Okay, well, it's good to hear people found the talk interesting. Any other comments, questions? Well, thank you for being here. I know I've thrown a lot of material at you. Try to sort of cram in as much as possible for an interesting experience. Thank you for being here. A bit surprised there are not more questions. It's quite a lot of material, but that's fine. That's great. Maybe it was all very clear. Okay, well, then I'm going to say thank you so much to everyone who tuned in. Hope you will check out the book. And also a big thank you to Moon Books for taking on my rather sort of quirky books and publishing them. So, Moon Books is a fantastic publisher, and we have a fantastic group of authors. So make sure you check out other books and other authors, and that you listen to the other talks, because MoonCon has been going for 2 days. So I think that's it from me for today.